racism against the Indigenous peoples of Canada, a modern-day genocide. Taking a quick look at the history behind Canada's genocide, it is apparent that it began with the actions that Prime Minister John Macdonald took towards the Indigenous peoples of Canada, beginning with the war against the Métis and Plains Cree. Once the war was over, Macdonald created laws that would become a system of control that we still see in our society today. Step 1 of enforcing control was forcing the Indigenous peoples onto reserves where he would control their rations going in. This was the start of a government-induced famine, the beginning of a genocide. Macdonald would go on to create the Blood Quantum Act. This was his way of ensuring the population of Indigenous peoples would no longer grow. All of these actions were deliberate acts of genocide in order to clear the plains for resettlement. Prime Minister John Macdonald was also responsible for the beginning of residential schools. The first residential school opened in Brantford, Ontario in 1883. By 1931, there was 80 fully functioning schools in operation across Canada. Residential schools helped Macdonald and the government ensure the success of colonialism in Canada. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were forced from their families and forced into residential schools where they experienced extreme amounts of abuse, ranging from emotional, spiritual, physical, and sexual abuse. Residential schools left children going home lacking the necessary skills, knowledge, and tools to cope with everyday life. These institutions taught parenting models based on punishment, abuse, coercion, and control. This was the basis for generational trauma. The last school closed in 1996. The number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls amounts to genocide according to the National Inquiry. To date, thousands have been reported missing, while most cases go unsolved. For many years, families of the victims, as well as activists, have pushed for an inquiry to be done because of the high number of reported cases. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ran his campaign on the inquiry, and to date there have been 230 recommendations in the report. In 2015, Senator Murray Sinclair experienced intense backlash after he called the policy that resulted in thousands of Indigenous children being forced into residential schools a cultural genocide, a statement supported by Beverly McLaughlin, former Chief of Justice of the Supreme Court. The National Inquiry states that while most police forces were more than willing to provide the information requested, while even providing extra time and resources, the RCMP was a different story. The RCMP, which is represented by the Department of Justice, resisted disclosing the files the inquiry sought. This created a large challenge to the forensic review team's ability to study the necessary documents according to the final report. Many of the 107 files provided were found to be unintelligible due to the redactions within. The RCMP claims that 70% of violence that results in missing and murdered Indigenous women and children is committed by Indigenous men, while the inquiry states that this figure is unreliable. The RCMP is responsible for policing 40% of Indigenous communities. 39% of unsolved cases falls within their jurisdiction. Too often, cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children are treated with indifference and marked with negative stereotypes. This leads to fewer cases being solved. Studies show that whenever there is a reasonable chance of conviction, Crown attorneys are too willing to accept plea bargains in exchange for reduced sentences. CBC examined 34 cases which the RCMP claimed involved no foul play. In all cases, there was reason to believe foul play was in fact involved. Some of the evidence that the CBC found was bruises, weird placements, as well as other factors that led experts to believe foul play was involved. Of the women interviewed, they described physical, sexual abuse, as well as excessive force used by police. The RCMP has failed to protect the Indigenous women and communities.